February 23rd, the federal election day in Germany, is coming real close, and politicians are debating so hard they're losing their hair.
Holy fuck.
So if you're learning German and want to follow the election campaigns, now is the perfect time to dive in. But have you ever wondered what is actually being said during the debates in the German Bundestag? Well, as a native German teacher, I'm gonna help you understand the mess that is German politics. Alright, the way this is gonna work is that I'll show you excerpts from some of the debates and analyze grammar and vocabulary. I'll take a few lines from speakers of all the established parties and briefly talk about their ideology in German, subtitles included. Also, make sure to stay until the end of the video as I have some bonus material coming your way. The minimum required level for this exercise is C1. However, I will explain the grammar in English so that everybody can take something away from this lesson. With that being said, let's jump right into it. Die Union. Die Union besteht eigentlich aus zwei Parteien, nämlich der CDU, kurz für Christlich-Demokratische Union, und der CSU, Christlich-Soziale Union, die es nur in Bayern gibt. Bei den Bundestagswahlen treten diese zwei Parteien aber immer gemeinsam als Union auf. Die Union ist konservativ, wirtschaftsliberal, föderalistisch wie auch proeuropäisch und ihre Kennfarbe ist schwarz. Dieser krasse Typ hier mit dem Avatar-Logo auf seinem Kopf ist der Parteivorsitzende Friedrich Merz. Der ist vor kurzem aufgrund eines Gesetzentwurfs unter Druck geraten. Schauen wir mal rein. Little side note, I'll add the explanations of all the different colors and abbreviations I use in this video on the lower half of the screen. Let's get started.
Und jetzt will ich Ihnen kurz sagen, was in diesem Gesetzentwurf steht, der in dieser Woche am Freitag in zweiter und dritter Lesung zur Abstimmung steht. Es stehen 3 Punkte darin. Erstens, die Wiederaufnahme des Begriffs Begrenzung als Zweck des Aufenthaltsgesetzes. Zweitens, die Beendigung des Familiennachzuges nur für diejenigen, die subsidiär Schutz gewährt bekommen, also für diejenigen, die kein dauerhaftes Aufenthaltsrecht in Deutschland haben. Und drittens, eine Erweiterung der Kompetenzen der Bundespolizei, damit die Bundespolizei mit eigenen Zuständigkeiten für aufenthaltsbeendende Maßnahmen sorgen kann.
We start off with the word und, which is usually not possible, but this is spoken German, so that's fine. We have a main clause, which is indicated by the verbs in the second and last position, and kurz can be translated as briefly here. We then have a subordinate clause indicated by the question word was. That means that the verb is at the end of the subordinate clause. Stehen usually means to stand, but in this context it means to be written. Gesetzentwurf is draft, and it is in the dative since in denotes a location here. Then we have another subordinate clause indicated by the relative pronoun der in the nominative plural, and 2 points of TKMolo, time and mode. Zur Abstimmung stehen is a construction meaning to be put to vote. So the first sentence is, and now I want to briefly tell you, formally, what is written in this draft that this week on Friday in the second and third reading is put to vote. Then we have an interesting sentence. Es has no lexical meaning here, it is just a so-called Begleitpartikel, accompanying particle, that makes the speech flow a bit better. Stehen again means to be written here, and darin is a pronominal adverb that means therein or in that or in it. I'll explain pronominal adverbs in a later video. Literally, the sentence could be translated as, there are written 3 points in it, but I'd rather translate it as, it consists of 3 points, or it consists of 3 parts. And then we get to the first point of the list, marked by the word erstens, first or firstly. It's pretty simple from here on. We have 2 nominative-genitive constructions, just a few longer words. Wiederaufnahme is resumption, Begriff is term, Begrenzung is border, Zweck is purpose, and Aufenthaltsgesetz is the Residency Act. So the first point is, first, the resumption of the term border as purpose of the Residency Act. Then we get to the second part. Beendigung means termination and Familiennachzug, family reunion, which is another nominative-genitive construction. Für is a preposition demanding the accusative, so we have the demonstrative pronoun diejenigen in the accusative here. And then another subordinate clause indicated by the relative pronoun die in the nominative case here. Subsidiärschutz literally means subsidiary protection, but this is a very complicated term. My knowledge is limited on EU regulations, but it refers to asylum seekers that don't fulfill the typical characteristics, but where it is still too dangerous to send them back to their home country. Gewährt bekommen means to be granted or to get granted, and it is at the end of the sentence due to the sentence being a subordinate clause. He then repeats, also für diejenigen, another subordinate clause with die in the nominative. Dauerhaft means permanent, Aufenthaltsrecht, right of residency, and then haben at the end of the sentence. So the whole sentence reads, Second, the termination of family reunion only for those who are granted subsidiary protection. So for those, also don't confuse also here, also means so in English. So for those that do not have a permanent right of residency in Germany. In the last part we have a double genitive, which is always beautiful. Erweiterung is extension, Kompetenzen are competencies, and Bundespolizei is the federal police. We then have the word damit, which can be translated as in order for somebody or something to do something, but I'd use the translation so that here. The caveat with this word is that it demands another subject, in this case die Bundespolizei in the nominative case here. We then have a preposition mit, demanding the dative case. Zuständigkeiten are responsibilities or jurisdiction, another preposition, für, demanding the accusative, and then we have a long word, aufenthaltsbeendende, which is a combination of a noun, Aufenthalt, and an active participle, beendend. And it means residency ending, Maßnahmen are measurements, then we have the modal verb at the end of the sentence due to the indicator damit, and the word sorgen means to ensure in this context. So the whole sentence reads, and third, an extension of the competencies of the federal police so that the federal police can ensure residency ending measurements with their own jurisdiction in their own jurisdiction. Die SPD. Die Abkürzung SPD steht für Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands und neben der Union ist sie die zweite große Kraft im Parlament. Die SPD hat 2021 mit 25,7% die meisten Stimmen erhalten und zusammen mit den Grünen und der FDP koaliert, weswegen wir unsere Regierung auch Ampel nennen. Die SPD ist sozial, europaorientiert und progressiv, aber nicht sozialistisch, wie einige denken. Ihre Kennfarbe ist rot und bisher war Olaf Scholz unser Bundeskanzler. Hier ist eine Rede von ihm.
Laut dem Grundsatzprogramm der CDU soll das Renteneintrittsalter an die Lebenserwartung gekoppelt werden. Heißt das dann im Klartext arbeiten bis 70 oder sogar darüber hinaus? Auch die Rente nach 45 Beitragsjahren wollen Konservative abschaffen. Das trifft alle, die nach der Schule eine Ausbildung angefangen haben und seither hart arbeiten. Und das ist hochgradig ungerecht.
He starts off with the preposition laut, that means according to in English, it doesn't mean loud, and the word Grundsatzprogramm, which is a synonym of Parteiprogramm, meaning party program. The CDU is in the genitive to describe whose program we're talking about here. We then have the modal verb soll, should, in the second position, and only then we get the subject of the sentence. Das Renteneintrittsalter, meaning retirement age. If we then take a look at the main verb of the sentence, koppeln, meaning to couple or to link something with something else, we can see that it uses a fixed preposition an plus accusative. Lebenserwartung is life expectancy, and the whole sentence is in the passive. So it reads, according to the party program of the CDU, the retirement age should be linked to the life expectancy. He then asks a question, which we can identify by the verb in the first position, and then we have a fun little construction im Klartext, meaning in plain terms. Arbeiten bis 70 is working until the age of 70. Sogar is even, and darüber hinaus literally means over that, outside, but it can be translated as beyond that here. So the sentence goes, does that then mean in plain terms, working until the age of 70 or even beyond that? The next sentence starts with the conjunction auch in position 0, and then we have die Rente, retirement, in the accusative in the first position. We then have the preposition nach, meaning after, which demands the dative case, and that dative case can also be identified by the additional n at the end of Beitragsjahren. Verb in the second position, want, and only then we get the subject of the sentence, Konservative, conservatives. Abschaffen means to abolish or to get rid of, but in a very juridical context. So the whole sentence reads, conservatives also want to abolish retirement after 45 years of contribution. Although the sentence focuses very much on retirement after 45 years of contribution, since that's the first thing he says. His last sentence consists of a very short main clause and two subordinate clauses strung together by the conjunction und, and the word treffen in the main clause is usually translated to meet or to hit, but in this very political context, I'd rather say to affect. We then have a relative pronoun in the nominative plural that indicates the subordinate clause. That also places the two verbs at the end of the sentence. The end of the sentence is in front of und, since und separates those two subordinate clauses. Nach is the preposition after, which demands the dative case, and eine Ausbildung, apprenticeship, is in the accusative here. After und in the second subordinate clause, we don't have to repeat the word die and can just leave it out. Seither could be translated as ever since, and arbeiten is at the end of the sentence. So until this point, the sentence goes, That affects everybody or all the people who started an apprenticeship after school and have been working hard ever since. And then the last sentence is a main clause again, so we have to put a comma before und. And in this main clause he just says, and this is unjust to a very high degree. Hochgradig is high degree and ungerecht is unjust. Die FDP. Die Freie Demokratische Partei oder auch FDP ist die Inkarnation des Spruchs „Der Markt regelt das schon". Sie ist von den Stimmen her meist auf dem 3. oder 4. Platz bei den Bundestagswahlen. Die FDP ist liberalistisch, marktorientiert und elitär. Sie sind aber keine Minimalisten, da bei ihnen der Staat trotzdem noch involviert ist. Ihre Kennfarbe ist gelb und Christian Lindner ist der neoliberale Jesus Christus der FDP. Hören wir mal rein.
Wie sollten wir unsere Wehrhaftigkeit stärken ohne Wirtschaftskraft? Welchen Eindruck machen unsere Argumente auf andere, wenn wir sie nicht wie in der Vergangenheit mit ökonomischem Erfolg untermauern können? Wir müssen einsehen, nicht moralische Überlegenheitsgefühle in der Außenpolitik sichern unseren Einfluss. Unsere wirtschaftliche Stärke ist zugleich unsere geopolitische Stärke.
He starts off with an open question and the question word wie, how, in position 0. Sollten, should is then in the first position and the question goes as usual. Wie is the subject and unsere Wehrhaftigkeit, our defensive capabilities, the object. He then finishes the sentence with the verb stärken, strengthen, but uses a preposition, ohne, without, with the accusative case, after the second verb, which is usually impossible, but again, this is spoken German, so it doesn't really matter. Wirtschaftskraft can be translated to economic power, so the whole sentence goes, how should we strengthen our defensive capabilities without economic power? He continues with another open question and the word welchen, which or what, and the construction Eindruck machen that uses the fixed preposition auf and the accusative and is translated to give an impression. Unsere Argumente are in the nominative case here, and the whole sentence reads, what impression do our arguments give others? And then we have a subordinate clause indicated by the word wenn, if, that is disconnected by an attribute further describing the arguments. Vergangenheit is past, ökonomischer Erfolg is economic success, and the word untermauern means to substantiate. So the whole sentence goes, what impression do our arguments give others if we can't substantiate them with economic success like in the past? The verb in the next sentence is quite interesting. Einsehen is a combination of to realize and to accept. He then continues the sentence with the word nicht, which is quite uncommon. And then this monster of a word is feelings of superiority. Außenpolitik is foreign affairs, and the verb sichern means to secure. Einfluss is influence. So the whole sentence is, we have to realize, we have to accept, not moral feelings of superiority in foreign affairs secure our influence. The last sentence is pretty easy, only the word zugleich can mean some different things. It can mean unanimously, but here I would just say also. So our economic power is also our geopolitical strength. Bündnis 90, die Grünen. Die Partei, die wir heute als Grüne kennen, ist eigentlich ein Bündnis aus zwei kleineren Parteien, daher der lange Name. Damals bei ihrer Gründung sind sie noch barfuß und in Hippie-Kleidung im Bundestag aufgetreten. Heute tragen sie inzwischen aber Anzüge, sieht besser aus. Die Grünen sind linksliberal und progressiv mit einem starken Fokus auf Umweltschutz und Nachhaltigkeit. Ihre Kennfarbe ist grün, falls das nicht offensichtlich gewesen sein sollte. Robert Habeck und Annalena Baerbock sind die Vorsitzenden der Partei und von Herrn Habeck habe ich hier einen Ausschnitt.
Ein positiver Lichtblick ist etwas, was uns wahrscheinlich am Anfang der Legislaturperiode niemand zugetraut hätte, dass wir den Ausbau der erneuerbaren Energien und des Stromnetzes etwa im Faktor 5 beschleunigen können. Und das haben wir getan, indem wir im Kern Bürokratie abgebaut haben, Genehmigungsverfahren schneller gemacht haben, in den Genehmigungsverfahren, die schon da waren, weitere zugemacht haben, wie bei Repowering oder in den genehmigten Trassen bei Stromnetzen zu bauen.
In the beginning we have a very simple main clause with the word Lichtblick, which means glimmer of hope. We then get a subordinate clause indicated by the word was. That also means that the verbs are placed at the end. And by looking at the verbs, we can see that we have the conditional clause 3 here, the hypothetical past. The word zutrauen is quite interesting. It doesn't really have a translation in English, but we could say that it means something like to think that somebody is capable of doing something. It uses a dative and an accusative. The dative is uns in this context, and the accusative is was, the question word. The word Legislaturperiode means legislative period, and it is in the genitive case modifying am Anfang in the beginning. So up until here, the whole sentence is, one positive glimmer of hope is something that probably no one would have thought that we're capable of doing in the beginning of the legislative period. And then he does something weird grammatically, he just uses the indicator das, that, without any reference. However, that means that also here the verbs are at the end of the sentence, and the verbs he is using is the modal verb kann, können, and beschleunigen, which means to accelerate. Den Ausbau, the expansion, is the accusative object of beschleunigen, and then we have the genitive of what is being expanded on. Im Faktor 5 means something like by a factor of 5, so the whole sentence goes that we are able to accelerate the expansion of renewable energies and the electricity grid by an approximate factor of 5. He then continues with a very simple main clause and the subordinate clause indicator indem that also places the verb at the end. The verb abbauen means something like dismantling in this context. Im Kern is translated as at the core. However, here I just say essentially or in essence. And of course, Bürokratie is bureaucracy, so up until the first comma we have, and we did that by essentially dismantling bureaucracy. Little side note here, in English, after using by, you do not have to use a subject, however, after the German indem, you need a subject. In this case, wir, nominative. He then continues with a list, however that list is within a subordinate clause, that means we have to place the verbs at the end of each section before the commas. He first talks about Genehmigungsverfahren, which are approval procedures, and if you're confused by the structure of the list, you can always put the word indem at the beginning of each section. That makes it a bit more digestible. So here potentially we could say, indem wir Genehmigungsverfahren schneller gemacht haben, so by speeding up approval procedures. He then continues the list with more approval procedures that get interrupted by another subordinate clause, indicated by the relative pronoun die, so the verb also goes to the end of this section, and then he closes off that whole thing with the last three words. So if we put indem wir to the front of this section as well, we get, by closing additional approval procedures that have been there already. He then refers to some of the areas where those approval procedures have been implemented in, this time indicated by the word wie that due to English grammar has a bit of a weird translation, as in the case of. So the whole sentence goes, as in the case of repowering or in the approved routes for power grids. So now you might notice that he said zu bauen at the end, which is kind of a weird thing to do because you don't really need a verb here, but I guess he refers to the construction of those approved routes, but I'm not really sure where that verb is coming from. Die Linke. Die linke Partei ist eine Verschmelzung der SPD-Abspaltung WASG und der PDS aus dem Jahr 2007. Die PDS war die Nachfolgepartei der SED, die die DDR regiert hat. Digga, so viele Abkürzungen. Es ist also nicht überraschend, dass die heutige Linke die einzige Partei ist, die nicht im Rahmen des Kapitalismus agiert. Sie sind demokratische Sozialisten, antimilitaristisch und sehr progressiv und ihre Kennfarbe ist pink. Heidi Reicheneck ist seit 2024 Parteivorsitzende. Hören wir mal rein.
Wer arbeitet, soll mehr haben. Das ist ja richtig. Aber keine Schikane, keine Kürzung, keine Zwangsarbeit bringt auch nur einer arbeitenden Person einen Cent mehr. Wenn Sie das wollen, dann erhöhen Sie den gesetzlichen Mindestlohn, her mit den Maßnahmen für höhere Tarifbindung und drehen Sie endlich unser Steuersystem vom Kopf auf die Füße. Entlasten Sie doch ehrliche Arbeit, gehen Sie ran an perverse Milliardenvermögen und Erbschaften. Und wenn Sie sich das schon nicht trauen, ja, dann schließen Sie doch wenigstens die Steuerschlupflöcher, wie das zum Beispiel das gerade Vonovia in Berlin genutzt hat. Hunderte Millionen Grunderwerbsteuer gehen uns dadurch die Lappen und gleichzeitig gibt es keine Zuschüsse mehr für Schulklassenfahrten. Warum regt sich darüber eigentlich niemand auf, frage ich mich.
So she starts quite simply by just using a quote from a member of another party. Wer arbeitet, soll mehr haben, who works should have more, or those who work should have more. In her first sentence, she uses a very interesting grammatical feature that the English language doesn't have. The sentence das ist richtig just means das ist korrekt. However, das ist ja richtig means that everybody knows that this is correct. The word ja, which doesn't mean yes here, is one of many modal particles in German. A modal particle can add an emotion, mood, or attitude to a sentence and is quite frequently used in colloquial German. She then continues with a negation of three nouns in the nominative case, bullying, cuts, and forced labor, the word bringen, to bring, the direct object einen Cent, which we could translate as a penny or 1 penny here, and then the dative who that cent would have been for. So the whole sentence goes, as we all know, that is correct, but no bullying, no cuts, no forced labor will bring even one working person 1 cent more. The next sentence is a very simple conditional clause 1, a logical consequence. If A, then B. The word erhöhen means to raise, and gesetzlicher Mindestlohn here in the accusative means legal minimum wage. So the whole sentence is, if you want that, then raise the legal minimum wage. The next sentence contains a very interesting construction many of you might not know yet, Herr plus mit and the dative case. It can mean multiple different things depending on the situation, such as gimme that, keep it coming, or bring it on, and you can also combine it with nouns like she's doing here. The preposition für uses the accusative, höhere Tarifbindung is a higher tariff commitment, then we have the conjunction und and an imperative, drehen Sie, formally, turn around or just turn. Endlich is finally, unser Steuersystem is the accusative, our tax system, and the expression vom Kopf auf die Füße, or more traditionally von Kopf auf Fuß, means on its head. So the whole sentence goes, keep the measures for higher tariff commitment coming and turn our tax system on its head. Since they're socialist, this is also a reference to a wealth tax. She then continues with another imperative and the verb entlasten, which means to relieve or take the load off something or somebody. And then we have another modal particle, doch. Doch is usually used as a reply to a negative question, however here it adds an accusation to the imperative. Since English doesn't really have these words, we could phrase it as a question, why don't you take the load of honest labor? Or you could use an adverb like finally relieve honest labor. Something along these lines. Okay, this sentence is not quite grammatically correct because you would usually have to put the prefix of the verb rangehen, which in colloquial German means something like to go for something, at the end of the sentence. But again, spoken German doesn't matter. Pervers is perverted, and she's talking about billion-euro fortunes and inheritances. So the whole sentence is, go for perverted billion-euro fortunes and inheritances. By the way, you might have noticed that we use the word Milliarde instead of billion. This is because we use the long scale instead of the short scale, where it goes Million, Milliarde, Billion, Billiarde, instead of million, billion, trillion. Then we have another very typical conditional clause 1 with the verb sich trauen, to dare. Schon nicht literally means already not, but in this context I'd say not even. Then the sentence gets interrupted by a passive-aggressive ja, and then we have the second half of the conditional clause. We have yet another modal particle, doch, expressing her frustration and impatience, the word wenigstens, at least, and Steuerschlupflöcher are tax loopholes, and then she continues with the scandal of Vonovia in Berlin. Vonovia is a real estate company that got into big trouble due to members of the executive board getting rich off of government grants. The subordinate clause is indicated by the relative pronoun das, that means that the verbs are placed at the end. So this whole sentence translates to, and if you don't even dare to do that, yeah, and then I'm paraphrasing the modality here, then could you please at least close the tax loopholes, for example the one that Vonovia has used in Berlin? Immediately after that, she's naming the consequences that this scandal had. Hunderte Millionen is not 100 million, but hundreds of millions. Then we have the word Grunderwerbsteuer, which is real estate transfer tax. And then she uses an interesting construction, durch die Lappen gehen, which literally means to go through the cloths, but it means to slip through somebody's fingers. The conjunction und, and then we have gleichzeitig at the same time. Zuschüsse are grants or benefits from the government, and to say no more in German, you have to put the noun in between no and more. So that's why we have keine Zuschüsse mehr. Then a simple accusative due to the preposition für, and so the whole sentence goes, hundreds of millions in real estate transfer tax are slipping through our fingers, and at the same time there are no more government benefits for school trips. In her last sentence, she asks herself a rhetorical question with the verb sich aufregen über plus accusative, which can be translated to get annoyed by or to get upset about. Darüber is another pronominal adverb, meaning about that. The subject of the sentence here is niemand. After the initial question, she says, frage ich mich, which literally means I ask myself, but you can translate that to I wonder in English. So the whole sentence is, why does nobody actually get upset about that, I wonder? Die AfD. Die AfD oder Alternative für Deutschland wurde 2013 gegründet und war eigentlich eine wirtschafts- und nationalliberale, europaskeptische Partei. Kleiner Spoiler, bis auf die Europaskepsis hat sich da einiges geändert.
Not to be racist or anything.
Im Laufe der letzten 12 Jahre hat die AfD immer mehr sogenannte Wutbürger, Enraged Citizens, aufgegriffen und ist heute viel mehr nationalistisch, islamfeindlich und rechtspopulistisch. Ihre Kennfarbe ist blau und die Vorsitzende heißt Alice Weidel. Hier ein Auszug.
Erstens müssen syrische Kriegsflüchtlinge, die vor dem Assad-Regime geflüchtet zu sein behaupten, die jetzt auf deutschen Straßen zu Zehntausenden die Befreiung Syriens feiern, und unter islamistischen Kampfgesängen über Weihnachtsmärkte und durch unsere Fußgängerzonen marschieren, sofort in die Heimat zurückkehren. Zweitens muss verhindert werden, dass neue Flüchtlingsströme den Asylansturm von 2015 noch in den Schatten stellen und abermals unerkannt kampfbereite Soldaten, Islamisten und Dschihadisten ins Land bringen.
So, despite the AfD not being the bastion of intelligence, she's actually cranking out some multi-clause sentences here. So let's get started. I first want to give you an overview over the main clause that is separated by multiple subordinate clauses to get a better understanding of what is actually being said. The subject of the sentence in the nominative is syrische Kriegsflüchtlinge, so Syrian war refugees. Then, if we skip all the subordinate clauses and we go to the last sentence here, we can see that the second verb is at the end of the sentence. Zurückkehren, which means to return. So the main clause is, first of all, Syrian refugees have to immediately return to their home country. That is the main clause, and then it gets a bit more detailed. Let's focus on the first subordinate clause that is introduced by the relative pronoun die in the nominative plural, referring to the Syrian war refugees. The main verb of this clause is flüchten, which can be translated to flee or to escape from, and it uses the fixed preposition vor plus dative. Vor dem Assad regime, from the Assad regime. However, she does not use the word sind at the end as if it was a fact. She says zu sein behaupten. The word behaupten means to claim. So the whole sentence goes, Syrian war refugees that claim to have escaped from the Assad regime, which is kinda insidious. Moving on to the second subordinate clause with die referring to the same Syrian war refugees and the verb feiern at the end of that section, in front of the conjunction und. Feiern means to celebrate, and the direct object is die Befreiung, liberation. The country whose liberation we're talking about is Syria, so that's in the genitive case here. Then we also have many parts of tekamolo. We have time, place, and mode. Now, on German streets, and by the tens of thousands. So this whole section goes, Syrian refugees that now celebrate the liberation of Syria on German streets by the tens of thousands. We then continue in the same subordinate clause, which means that the verb marschieren, to march, has to be placed at the end of the section. And we could denote that by an additional die, but that's too much die. And then we have a lot of prepositions. Unter usually means under, but in this case among, or just using the gerund in English. Islamist battle songs, then the direction, über plus accusative, over Christmas markets, another conjunction und, continuing the idea of über, through our pedestrian zones. So the whole sentence goes, first, Syrian war refugees that claim to have escaped the Assad regime, that now celebrate the liberation of Syria on German streets by the tens of thousands, and chanting Islamist battle songs, march over Christmas markets and through our pedestrian zones, have to return to their home country immediately. Her second sentence is as disturbing as the first one, but a bit easier grammar-wise. We have the verb verhindern, which means to prevent, in the passive with the modal verb müssen. So, second, it has to be prevented. We then get the indicator das that introduces a subordinate clause, and that clause ends with the expression in den Schatten stellen, which is to overshadow or to put in the shade. Flüchtlingsströme are streams of refugees. The word Ansturm is very loaded here. It means something like onslaught or onrush. We then have another conjunction und that connects the two subordinate clauses, and that also means that we have to put the verb bringen, to bring, at the end of the sentence. We could potentially use another das sie, but that's not really necessary here. The word abermals is also very loaded. It means once again, but as if they'd done that 1,000 times already. Unerkannt means without detection or undetected, but we'll talk about this in a second. Combat-ready soldiers, Islamists and jihadists, and they want to bring them into the country. We have ins Land, which is short for in das Land, and it is in the accusative because the preposition in denotes a direction here. The word unerkannt is very important. This word has no ending. That means she's not talking about undetected combat-ready soldiers, but rather about combat-ready soldiers that were brought here without detection. The reason for that is that the word unerkannt is an adverb describing the verb bringen, not the noun Soldaten. So if we summarize everything, the whole sentence goes: second, it has to be prevented that new streams of refugees overshadow the asylum onslaught of 2015, and that they once again bring combat-ready soldiers, Islamists and jihadists into the country without detection. Jesus Christ, chill. Kommen wir zur letzten Partei von heute, das BSW. BSW ist kurz für Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht und genau diese Dame ist auch schon die Vorsitzende der Partei. Frau Wagenknecht war früher in der linken Partei, hat aus ideologischen Gründen aber ihre eigene Partei gegründet. Das BSW ist ideologisch gesehen eine seltsame Partei. Auf der einen Seite antimilitaristisch, proeuropäisch und sozioökonomisch links, auf der anderen Seite aber immigrationskritisch, populistisch und soziokulturell rechts. Die Kennfarbe des BSW ist lila, hören wir mal rein.
Ich höre, die SPD will die Lebensmittelpreise senken und 95% der Bevölkerung entlasten. Super Idee. Man fragt sich nur, warum haben Sie 3 Jahre lang eine Politik gemacht, die die Lebensmittel extrem verteuert und 95% der Menschen mit steigenden Verbrauchssteuern und steigenden Abgaben belastet hat. Jetzt im Januar nochmal werden die Krankenkassenbeiträge und der CO2-Preis kräftig erhöht. Aber nach der Wahl soll alles plötzlich ganz anders werden. Das glaubt Ihnen doch kein Mensch mehr.
Her first sentence just consists of 2 main clauses, very simple. We have a modal verb will and senken, which means to lower. At the end of the first section, then the conjunction und, which separates those 2 main clauses. And you could again put die SPD in front of 95%, but that's not really necessary because the subject is still very clear. The sentence is not too long. And the word entlasten, which we had before, means to relieve or to take the load off of something. By the way, you can also translate entlasten as to take pressure away from somebody. So the whole sentence can be translated as, I hear the SPD wants to lower food costs and take some pressure away from 95% of the population. Great idea. She starts her next sentence with the word man, which if you have been learning German for quite some time, you know translates to one, but you can also say you or they depending on the situation. So literally this first section means one wonders only. However, I'd personally translate it as you can only wonder. She then goes to ask her question with a main part and 2 subordinate clauses strung together by the conjunction und. Let's first focus on the main part. We have the question word warum, why in the first position, and then the perfect tense. Politik machen literally means to make politics, but you could also say to pursue a policy here. 3 Jahre lang is a synonym of für 3 Jahre, but in this context it sounds way more natural and I'd advise you to use that form as well. We have the formal personal pronoun sie, and then we get a subordinate clause indicated by the relative pronoun die. That means that the verb is placed at the end, and the end here means in front of the conjunction. Verteuern with the accusative means to increase the prices of something. Hier die Lebensmittel, groceries. Extrem is just extremely as an adverb. We then have the conjunction, and we could potentially use die again, but we leave that out. We then have the same construction as earlier with 95% of somebody. Der Menschen here is in the genitive case. And then at the end of the sentence, we have the word belasten, which means to burden somebody with something, and we have the with here in the dative case, the active participle of steigen, to rise, so rising, and another und connecting 2 of the things that are rising. So this whole sentence goes, why have you pursued a policy for 3 years that has made food extremely expensive and burdened 95% of the people with rising consumption taxes and rising excise dues? Abgaben comes from the verb abgeben, to give something away, but we're basically also talking about taxes here. She starts her next sentence by using the time in the first place. That means we have to place the subject after the first verb. The subject of this sentence is die Krankenkassenbeiträge und der CO2-Preis. Krankenkasse is health insurance and Beiträge is contributions. CO2-Preis should be pretty self-explanatory here. The whole first part of the sentence is in the passive mood. We have werden erhöht, so are being increased. Kräftig comes from the word Kraft, strength, but as an adverb you could translate it as heavily. Then we have the conjunction aber, which separates the 2 main clauses, the preposition nach, which takes the dative, so after the election, and then the word soll, which is always very difficult to translate, but I guess you could say supposed to in this context, and the word werden, to become in the last position here. So the whole sentence goes, now, in January, again, health insurance contributions and the CO2 price are being heavily increased, but after the election, everything is suddenly supposed to be completely different. Her last sentence is an accusation which we can beautifully see by looking at the modal particle doch. The subject of this sentence is kein Mensch, so nobody or no person. The mehr in this context means nobody anymore, or no one ever, something like that. Das is in the accusative, and this word describes everything she's been talking about. And Ihnen referring to the SPD in the dative. So the last sentence could be translated as, nobody would ever believe you that again. Alright, that sums it up pretty well. These are the parties we can vote for in Germany on February 23rd. If you live in Germany and are allowed to vote, or if you're just curious to see what party would fit you best, there's a great website to find that out. It is called the Wahl-o-mat, and it's a political questionnaire for people who haven't decided who to vote for yet. Essentially, by answering all of the questions, the app will recommend the parties that are most likely to represent your political opinions. Give it a try and share your results in the comments. You can find a link to the app in the description. And that brings me to the end of this video. If you have any questions or need some more clarification, make sure to drop a comment. Also, you can help this channel grow and never miss out on a German lesson by liking and subscribing. Thank you for watching and haut rein!